Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to the Watch Chronicler podcast. In today's episode you'll immediately have noticed something a bit different because I am on camera. And the reason for this really is because what I'm going to talk about today in this episode is not something which you can annotate or present with images terribly well. I'll be talking about scratches in watches and damage to watches, because this is a theme which people often talk about. It's something which is to a great extent inevitable when you own a watch, and so I'd like to unpack this situation where people are either disappointed they've damaged their watch or are concerned about the value which that will impact. So I'd like to speak about all of that in today's podcast, and so those on YouTube will see me on camera instead of the usual black screen. That does also mean that I'm not going to cut this quite as aggressively as I normally do, so if I and ah a bit, then do bear with me. If I look over to my side here, you'll notice that I'm just checking my notes, just to keep an eye on things. But at the moment, just as a news update, the watch industry in the UK is pretty much stalled, as it is around the world. At the moment, those based in the UK will have seen that new measures have been taken to reduce people's travel, whether it's to work or for any other reason. And so I think the next few months are going to be certainly significant for the watch industry. But at least in the modern media world, we have ample entertainment whilst we stay at home, so I'm sure we'll manage with that. But do, of course, whilst I'm here on camera, do remember to head over to the Watch Chronicler website to be able to read articles and new pieces to keep you up to date on the watch industry and interesting reflections about what's going on, whether that's about watches or the industry surrounding it. And of course check out our Instagram to be able to be kept up to date about podcasts, videos and articles and everything else. And today's episode is sponsored by Oris, a maker of technologically very interesting and attractive watches for a reasonable price, but you'll hear more about that a bit later. Now, the first thing I'd like to note in this podcast is the fact that watches will inevitably get damaged. I think that we're often shown pictures of incredibly well-maintained vintage watches, whether it's by auction houses or the press, and the fact is that most watches don't survive that well. I suspect the vast majority of vintage watches of value have been damaged or lost at some point because they're treated like watches. And watches, inevitably, being part of our daily lives, get damaged. It's impossible to avoid. And the fact is that this is both a fact that the probability of bumping your watch, whether it's on a door handle, a door jamb, or just even being careful with it. Because the fact is that anything with a hardness of roughly 7 Mohs or less, which is significantly harder than most steels, which are at about 5.5, will be damaged over time and wear down due to particles of sand and dust in the air. You find this with jewellery, and it's the same thing with watches. Unless you don't wear a watch and you leave it in its box or in a safe, you can expect to pick up scratches on it. And some people have noted the fact that some metals resist scratches better than others, and that is true. For example, Zinn's tegament technology on their watches is extremely successful at keeping scratches off a watch, but even so, a resistance like that has its drawbacks as well. So, for example, if you look at a tegamented bezel, if you whack it hard enough, then it ends up having a sort of an eggshell effect, whereby the surface of the metal, because it's harder than the core, can crack. And this is difficult to do, but the truth is that anything can be damaged if it's not treated correctly, and even something which is treated correctly will be damaged over time. With watches we have a philosophy of not wanting to replace parts, which is in some ways very different to things like the car industry, where if you hunt around for a replacement part and you bring a car back up to original specifications, you're praised for it, whereas with watches it's viewed with a bit of resistance from collectors who want everything to be absolutely original, so it's a matter of perspective. But another aspect which is interesting about scratches on watches is the fact that people often say titanium is a softer material in terms of damage than most steels. And that's not technically true. If you look at the Vickers hardness, surface hardness of a lot of these of these titanium pieces, if we take grade 2 titanium, which is more popular in more affordable pieces, and that's a very pure titanium. Grade 5 is the alternative, which is more resilient and can be polished much more successfully, but at the same time it's more expensive. Grade 2 titanium compared to standard 316L steel is a bit harder at about 210 Vickers to 316L steel's 155 or so. But whilst people compare these two things like for like, they don't take into account the fact that some DLC watches have a hardness of 2000 Vickers and yet they still lose their PVD coating over time because it's bumped and it's scratched and so on. So in reality, the difference between steel and titanium is negligible, and other factors have a lot more to say about whether you damage your watch or not. Like, for example, the fact that with titanium, because of the darker colour, because of the way it has its reacted coating of titanium, which has reacted with its environment, scratches are much more obvious, which is something which is neither here nor there. But you have to be aware of if you're buying these sorts of things. And the overall message here is that whatever you do, you have to be at peace with the fact that your watch will likely get scratched over time. In the past, I've been extremely annoyed about damaging a watch, whether it was something particularly valuable or something which I just liked a lot, and I bumped it or scratched it or whatever. But now I accept these things. And the truth is that an example which I think says a lot about this was when I bought a Seiko Marine Master 300. Those who've been watching the YouTube channel, the Watch Chronicler YouTube channel, formerly Arm on the Watch Guy, will know that I owned a Seiko Marine Master 300 for about a year. In fact, I ordered it whilst I was at Baselworld. I saw the green ceramic bezel version released the last time I went to Baselworld, which was 2018, and whilst at the show I ordered an SBDX 017, that's the one with the lacquered bezel, so the previous generation to what we have now, and it was a sublime watch. The finishing across it, that Zaratsu polishing was superb. Whether you looked at the flanks of the case, the brushed elements, the general build, it was a gorgeous watch, but apart from the problem I had with the bezel, which was that the click spring within the bezel broke, which actually is the second time I broke a bezel click spring within a few months of owning it from Seiko. Apart from that, it was a marvellous watch. However, I bought it enjoying the pure and perfect nature of the case, without considering the fact that over time, if I was going to wear this watch regularly, it was going to get bumped, it was going to get damaged, and gradually that sort of honeymoon with it wore off. And this is something to be aware of. On the other side, if you look at my Seamaster 300M, that's the previous generation 300M, the last sort of pseudo ETA powered version, but with coaxial escapement with the ceramic bezel. That's a watch which I bought used for significantly less than its retail price, and I haven't babied that watch at all. It already had scratches on it when I bought it, and it developed more of them as I owned it, with nicks appearing on the bezel, on the case flanks and so on. Now, nothing major, but each scratch has developed a certain story, whether it was a bump on the a very, very small bump, it has to be said, on the bezel from when I was given the wonderful opportunity to ride in a race-prepared 60s Reaver on Lake Maggiore a few years ago, which is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, something I'm sure I'll never have the opportunity to do again. But I remember it from that, or learning to ski whilst wearing it, or scratching the bezel after finishing the last James Bond, Ian Fleming James Bond novel, which seemed somewhat apt for the watch. Each of these scratches have a story, and that's something important to remember. And this is why you really shouldn't buy a watch expecting for it to stay pristine unless you don't intend to wear it, because otherwise it's very likely you'll be disappointed. Watches are living things in the sense that you live with them. Obviously they're inanimate objects, but you live with them and you live through them in a sense. So you have to be aware that scratches and bumps are an inevitability. But now a message from our sponsor. Often regarded as an inaccessible feature offered only by the most prestigious and historic of brands, the tourbillon is a mechanism designed to rotate the escapement of a watch, thus accounting for gravity. Whilst functionally curious, the view of this complication has fascinated watch lovers for years, yet today we see a change of tack for this feature. Orage has conceived a Swiss-made tourbillon available for an entirely unprecedented price of under 7,000 francs. Produced with an emphasis on precision, accuracy and quality, these movements are conceived to balance Swiss tradition with absolute modernity at half the price of the nearest contender. Designed to advance this complication, Orage have created a unique aesthetic supported with quality. And having visited Orage's facilities in Biel, Switzerland, I can speak for the quality and care with which these movements are designed for everyday life. In this way, the tourbillon 1 from Orage represents the exceptional made accessible, and the tourbillon taken from the atelier to the laboratory. Learn more at orage.com. Now, of course, there are some ways you can ward off scratches and damage to your watch by simply being careful. But it's very likely that there'll be a day when you're caught by surprise and you're in a hurry. You're putting on your clothes or your jacket as you try to get out of the house, you're getting into the car, and you clip the watch on something, and that's it. But the one aspect about this, which is the title of this podcast actually, which is that the first scratch is the deepest. And this is something which is obviously a play on words on a well-known phrase, but it is true, I think, with a lot of watches. If you're comfortable with the first scratch being put into it, you can relax, you can enjoy the watch, and not have to worry about it anymore, which is an important aspect when buying a watch and enjoying it. And I think that in recent years, watches have become massively valuable. Now, I would never recommend that someone invest in a watch, but the truth is that watches which people bought 10 or 20 years ago are now generally, if they bought with a reasonable sense of logic in terms of a decent brand, even ignoring the fact that some models are more popular than others, you're likely to have a more valuable watch than it originally was. And I think this has drawn away from people just being able to enjoy a watch for what it is. The fact is that most people will not find a Rolex Daytona from the 60s in a drawer, but most other watches will have gone up in value. But that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy them. There's no shame in enjoying a watch and being relaxed. I'd encourage, in fact, anyone who is worrying about a scratch they've put into their watch to go onto Google and look for this one picture of, if memory serves, either a Rolex Submariner or a Sea Dweller, which was involved in a motorcycle accident. And of course the watch has been absolutely eviscerated. The bracelet has been scraped beyond repair. The bezel looks like it's virtually melted in contact with the tarmac. The indices have fallen off, the hands have fallen off. And I think that puts things into a certain amount of perspective as to just the kind of damage which would in the past have been seen as a write-off with a watch which wasn't as valuable as it is today, when the fact is that a watch nowadays is immediately classed as a luxury good which should be babied. And so I think that this level of perspective is very important. Of course, some people will want to rectify scratches by having the watch polished or refinished, and there are an enormous number of different practices which will perform this act of sort of resurrecting a watch, so to speak, which has gone through the wars. On the cruder end, there is just simple polishing with a polishing wheel, which tends to remove a lot of the character from a case. It removes a lot of the sharp lines. And now, if you want your watch to just be shiny again, then by all means. Frankly, who am I to tell you what to do with your watch? But it is worth noting the fact that the watch can never be put back to the way it was. And that's why I tend to regard scratches as just something I have to live with. It's something which has happened to the watch. It's like, for example, my car. I can see where my hands have held the steering wheel. I can see where the gear stick has worn out a little bit in some areas, and it's just part of the wear and tear of the car. One practice, though, which I do find extremely clever, and frankly is not a bad idea, actually, if you're that way inclined and you want a watch which has had serious damage, like a serious bump to the case or something like that, repaired, especially where it's a structural point of the watch, an area which it could get worse, is this practice of spot welding, where they'll add steel. I haven't seen this done actually with a metal other than steel. I don't know, frankly, whether it could be done, but where additional steel is welded into the case and then refinished with the case to fill in any divots or bumps, which is fantastically clever. But again, you should never feel any obligation to refinish a watch. Frankly, scratches are there to be lived with, and as with the title of this podcast, once you've seen the first few scratches on a watch, there's nowhere to go from that. It's just now in part of the story of the watch. The first scratch is the deepest. Once a watch is used, it's used. Inevitably, you lose a certain amount from new, but no watch is ever going to stay new forever. And anyone trying to pass off a used watch as new is very easily. It's very easy to tell when a watch has been worn because there are inevitably marks, and that's just part of owning a watch. But tell me what you think in the comments section. Of course, listen to this podcast elsewhere if you want to listen to it on the go, although, of course, frankly, at the moment, that's for a lot of people an impossibility. This podcast is available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and anywhere else you can find a podcast. You'll find it listed. But do tell me what you think. I'd be very interested to know how you treat scratches, how you view scratches on your watches. If some watches you find you don't mind scratches, on others you do, I'd be fascinated to hear what you think. And of course, remember to like, share and subscribe. But thank you very much for watching and listening, depending upon where you're witnessing this. And I wish you all the best in these relatively difficult times. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com, out.